Hey everyone, welcome back for part 3 of History of Assyria. And so now we come to another great king of the Middle Assyrian Empire, Tukulti-Ninurta I. Now he was an extremely powerful ruler who many believe is the same person as Nimrod in the Hebrew book of Genesis. Reigning from 1243 to 1207 BCE, Tukulti-Ninurta started his career as a king in a very fortuitous position. He was the son of Shalmaneser I, and luckily for him, he inherited the empire that both his father and grandfather had worked so painstakingly to establish. As you may recall from the last part, both of these men had dealt with a kingdom to Assyria's north known as the Mitanni. When the Hittites put an end to them, the Assyrians marched into the former Mitanni domains to their north and claimed them. Thus, Tukulti-Ninurta I inherited an empire that was largely stable and wealthy by the time he took the throne. He, though, wasn't content with this and wanted to make his own mark on Assyrian history. So as mentioned earlier, Assyria's old rival, the kingdom of Mitanni, had been conquered by the Hittites, specifically under their king Supil-Liluma I. I always have trouble saying that name, but I'll spell it out for you over here so that you can reference it later. Actually, try pronouncing it. It's quite a tongue twister. Anyway, this was during the time of Tukulti's grandfather, Adad-Nirari I, and also stretched into the time of his father, Shalmaneser I. When I say father, I mean Tukulti's father, Shalmaneser I. Since then, Hittite influence and power had declined, and by the time Tukulti-Ninurta I took the throne in 1244 BCE, Hittite territories in southeastern Anatolia were ripe for the taking. Now the Hittite king at this time was a man named Tudhaliya IV, who honestly his name is much easier to pronounce than that of his predecessor. As he had no real military victories to his credit, Tudhaliya decided to position himself as a great builder. He commissioned many projects, including the founding of 26 temples and the renovation of his already large and luxurious palace. The thing though is that all grand building projects, especially in the ancient world, were extremely costly and took up enormous amounts of resources. The return on investment of these projects also isn't immediate. The fact that his country was going through a famine didn't help him either. Soon, Tudhaliya was using whatever funds he had left to buy grain instead of bricks. He even wrote to the pharaoh in Egypt requesting for grain to keep his people from starving. With whatever money available being put into foodstuffs, Hittite soldiers were not getting paid, and if they were not getting paid, then, well, they simply walked off their job. This happened in many of the Hittite Empire's westernmost cities. Without soldiers to keep their citizens in line, these cities ended up revolting. So with troops from the interior of his empire, Tudhaliya marched out to subdue these rabble-rousers, something which Tukulti-Ninurta took notice of. In 1245 BCE, he attacked the Hittite Empire. Tukulti-Ninurta met Tudhaliya on the battlefield of Erbila in an encounter that the latter says was intended to be a trick. The story is that because he had the weaker of the two armies, Tudhaliya tried to win the battle through trickery. In a letter that Tukulti-Ninurta purportedly wrote to one of his allies, he writes, quote, "I prepared my army and my chariots, but before I could reach his city, Tudhaliya, the king of the Hittites, sent out a messenger who was holding 2 tablets with hostile words and 1 with friendly words. He showed me the 2 with a hostile challenge first. When my army heard about these words, they were anxious to fight, ready to set out at once. The messenger saw this. So then he gave me the 3rd tablet, which said, 'I am not hostile to the king of Ashur, my brother. Why should we be brothers at war with each other?' But I brought my army on. He was stationed with his soldiers at the city of Nirija, so I sent him a messenger, saying, 'I'll besiege the city. If you are truly friendly to me, leave the city at once.' But he did not reply to my message, so I withdrew my army a little way back from the city. Then a Hittite deserter fled from Tudhaliya's army and reached me. He said, 'The king may be writing to you evasively, in friendship, but his troops are in battle order. He's ready to march.' So I called my troops out and marched against him, and I won a great victory." End of quote. It is said that after the battle, Tukulti-Ninurta took 28,800 Hittite soldiers as prisoners of war. While he could have pursued Tudhaliya and destroyed the rest of his army, Tukulti-Ninurta instead chose to march back to Ashur with his spoils and reorganize his army to deal with the Babylonians to the south of Assyria. The Babylonian king, Kashtiliash IV, had crossed his often fluid border with Assyria and claimed several villages there. This, though, was nothing new. The two sides had had border disputes for years. In her book, The History of the Ancient World, Susan Bauer writes about this complicated relationship. She states that, and I quote, "Babylon had had an ambiguous relationship with Assyria for years. Each city had, at various times, claimed the right to rule the other. Babylon and Ashur were not only balanced in strength, but also twins in culture. They had once been part of the same empire, under Hammurabi, and essentially the Babylonian stamp of the whole area remained visible. Assyria and Babylon shared the same gods, albeit with occasionally different names. Their gods had the same stories, and the Assyrians used Babylonian cuneiform in their inscriptions and their annals." End of quote. Kashtiliash IV had made a miscalculation. He probably thought that Tukulti-Ninurta would have spent more time fighting and then pursuing the Hittites than he actually did. This would have been Babylon's chance to gain a bit of territory that they could also negotiate the return of later on terms favorable to them. Tukulti, though, wasn't having any of it. Upon returning to his capital of Ashur, the Assyrian king reorganized his army and immediately marched south. The Assyrian army captured, sacked, and looted Babylon. With the city in ruins, Tukulti took the great statue of Babylon's patron deity, the god Marduk, along with a sizable portion of the population, back to Assyria as slaves, including the king, Kashtiliash IV. He then placed an Assyrian official in charge of rebuilding and governing Babylon. Possibly to celebrate his great victory, Tukulti-Ninurta built a new capital for himself, called Kar-Kutulti-Ninurta, across the Tigris River from Ashur. Some scholars believe that the city had already been commissioned before the Babylonian campaign. But regardless, Tukulti-Ninurta spent the last years of his reign ruling from there. Now, his reasons for building or moving to a new capital are not known, but many scholars believe that Tukulti-Ninurta did so because he feared public opinion, especially in the capital of Ashur. This might seem a bit odd. After all, didn't he just all but knock out the Hittite Empire, decisively defeat and annex his regional rival of Babylonia, and also bring hordes of new wealth into his realm? The answer to all of these is yes. However, the Assyrians and Tukulti-Ninurta were a religious bunch. It's one thing to conquer a city, but another to sack and loot one like Babylon. In his book, The Might That Was Assyria, the scholar H.W.F. Saggs writes, and I quote, "Babylonia was not a land of barbarians that could be invaded at will like the regions beyond Assyria's northern borders. It was the source and center of civilization, and its capital, Babylon, was a religious shrine of the highest sanctity. To sack Babylon in the ancient world was like sacking the Vatican or Jerusalem or Mecca in our own time." End of quote. So it seems like our man Tukulti-Ninurta may have feared that the gods would punish him for such an offense, and when the gods punished or showed disfavor towards a king, it was usually by dethroning that king, often via an assassination. Many of the citizens of Ashur, itself a holy city, may have lost faith in Tukulti for his most impious deed, and hence he felt the need to move to a more suitable spot across the Tigris, putting a river between him and any disgruntled mob. Okay, so that last part is my opinion, but it kind of makes sense. If trouble for Tukulti was brewing in Ashur, he'd have more than enough time to flee. Perhaps as a form of propaganda, Tukulti-Ninurta issued the compilation of a great epic which justifies his campaign against Babylon and the looting of the temples. In the epic, the only Assyrian one that we know of, the story goes on to say that Tukulti had no choice but to sack Babylon because their king, Kashtiliash, had broken the laws ordained by the gods, as well as several treaties between the two neighbors. The poem starts with Tukulti-Ninurta addressing the sun god Shamash, saying, quote, "I respected your oath, I feared your greatness," end of quote. He then goes on to talk smash about Kashtiliash, saying, quote, He had no fear of your oath. He transgressed your command. He schemed an act of malice. End of quote. The epic goes on to state that Tukulti wanted to be friends with Babylonia, but that Kashtiliash made this impossible. With oaths broken and the gods insulted, Tukulti-Ninurta had no choice but to take Babylon and its treasures from the possession of the vile Kashtiliash and his Kassite goons. The Kassites were the ruling house of Babylon at the time. Now, the Babylonians' own account of the matter, preserved in one of their chronicles, is much less laudatory. It tells that Tukulti, quote, put Babylonians to the sword, and that the treasure of Babylon he profanely brought out, and he took the great god Marduk off to Assyria, end of quote. It is likely that along with these, Tukulti-Ninurta also brought back Babylonian scribes and tablets that would be the foundation of the great library of Assyria. Though a beautiful and, I guess you could say, heroic epic, it may not have been enough to satisfy the religious sensibilities of both the Babylonians and the Assyrians, who felt that Tukulti-Ninurta's treatment of the city had been way too harsh and sacrilegious for something as trivial as a border dispute. Not only this, but he had also seemingly personally profited from the wealth stolen from Babylon's temple. This was wealth that actually belonged to the gods, not to any man. The fact that he took this wealth and refurbished or renovated his luxurious palace probably also wasn't very popular with both the Assyrians and the Babylonians. The people of Ashur no doubt noticed this, and it's likely that instead of seeing him as a great conqueror and wise ruler, they now viewed him simply as another corrupt despot. I suppose then it's only fitting that this story has some sort of moral at the end. Tukulti-Ninurta, though he had reigned for 37 years and was up until then the most powerful Assyrian ruler of them all, had done great wrongs in the eyes of gods and men. The Babylonian chronicles don't mince words, and they say that, quote, as for Tukulti-Ninurta, who had brought evil upon Babylon, his son and the nobles of Assyria revolted, and they cast him from his throne and imprisoned him in his own palace complex and killed him with a sword. End of quote. Afterward, we're told that the country went into civil war, after which his son, Ashur-nadin-apli, also believed to have been one of his assassins, or perhaps a conspirator, took to the throne. With all of the chaos going on, the Babylonians were able to reassert their independence and kick the Assyrians out. However, it would still be a few decades before the great statue of their chief god, Marduk, would be brought back to their, or rather his, temple in Babylon. Now, as often happened when charismatic rulers of the ancient world with long reigns died, chaos generally ensued. This led to a short, dark, or you could say stagnant period in Assyrian history, one that wasn't reversed until the rule of Assyria's next great monarch, Tiglath-Pileser I. We'll talk about him in part 4. Thanks again for stopping by. If you liked the video, please press that like button because it helps out the channel a lot. Thanks and have a great day.